They say history is written by the victors, but some truths were never meant to be recorded. Some stories vanish because they are too dangerous, too potent, too destabilizing for ordinary minds. Tonight, you are about to step into one of those stories. A tale so unsettling that even the most skeptical minds feel it creep beneath the skin, whispering in the dark, questioning everything you thought was possible. It begins in 1837, in the cold hills of Pennsylvania, where the snow falls like ash and the wind carries secrets older than any church or courthouse. A woman named Margaret Whitmore, a quiet widow, became the subject of whispers in the small town. They spoke of her as if she were touched by forces no human could comprehend. People said she was pregnant with twins, an unremarkable story by itself, but then they noticed something impossible. One of the twins was said to be born not as the child of this century, but of another, a century apart. A temporal anomaly, a rupture in the very flow of time, and no one alive could explain how or why. Margaret herself, pale and haunted, carried the secret like a scar. She was visited by strangers cloaked in authority, men who wore the veneer of medicine and science, but whose eyes burned with something far colder. They questioned her gently, but their questions were loaded with a hidden force, probing not for truth, but for control. You must understand, the power structures of that era, the invisible networks of influence, would have done anything to suppress knowledge that undermined their conception of reality. What Margaret held in her womb was not merely a child. It was a key, a living disruption, a challenge to the foundations of time and authority itself. The townsfolk whispered that she spoke to herself in strange ways, as if she had two minds inhabiting the same body. She walked the streets at night, her gaze distant, as if seeing not just this world, but another laid beneath it. And though most dismissed it as hysteria, the elite knew better. They sensed that in Margaret Whitmore, something primal, something forbidden, had surfaced, something that could undo the careful architecture of control they had built over centuries. You are about to enter that architecture. You are about to see the mechanisms of suppression, manipulation, and hidden knowledge in action. And once you do, there's no turning back. This is not just a story of a woman and her impossible children. It is a story of the forces that move unseen, guiding destiny, rewriting reality, and punishing those who dare to perceive too much. Margaret's twins were born, each carrying a temporal signature, each defying explanation. But this was only the beginning. The world around her would react not with understanding, but with obsession, fear, and the systematic exertion of power. And you, if you continue, will witness what even history itself has tried to erase. The first child came quietly, almost imperceptibly, into a world that refused to notice the extraordinary. Named Eliza, she seemed normal to the casual observer. Soft cries, delicate fingers, a fragile body wrapped in linen. But Margaret could feel the anomaly immediately. Eliza's presence carried a weight, a resonance, as if she bore memories that were not yet lived. Her eyes, wide and knowing, seemed to recognize centuries that had not yet arrived. She whispered in dreams things Margaret could not understand, visions of cities that did not exist, of wars and plagues that had not yet touched the earth, and of faces from times no one alive should have known. Word of the child spread cautiously. The neighbors whispered about Margaret, about the strange timing of her labor, about the eerie clarity in Eliza's gaze. But the real watchers were not in the streets or the taverns. They came in shadows and in silence. Men and women of influence, draped in the authority of science, religion, and law, arrived under the guise of concern. They studied Margaret, her home, her child, and they spoke in a language designed to confuse and intimidate. Their goal was simple: to contain the uncontainable, to observe without interference, to decide which truths were too dangerous to allow into the consciousness of the public. Margaret, however, was not naive. She sensed their presence, felt their invisible eyes pressing into her very thoughts. She realized that her children, both of them, though she had not yet delivered the second, were being treated not as humans but as artifacts, anomalies to be catalogued, dissected, controlled. And as she looked into Eliza's eyes, she understood something deeper. These forces did not merely fear the child. They feared what the child represented, the collapse of time as they had constructed it, the exposure of lies older than any government or institution. By the second week of Eliza's life, Margaret began to record what she saw. Secret diaries, sketches of visions, cryptic symbols. She wrote in her hand, trembling with fear and revelation, knowing that if these records were discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic. Already, she felt the pressure of external control, the subtle but relentless insistence that she obey, that she conform, that she silence her intuition. But Margaret could not stop seeing the future in her child's eyes, and she could not stop feeling the presence of something ancient, watching, guiding, perhaps manipulating events from beyond comprehension. And so, the first twin grew under a shadow, an invisible network of control, psychological observation, and societal manipulation. Her every movement, her cries, her first laughs were catalogued, analyzed, and interpreted. What the elite of the time could not yet name, they would one day call a breach in reality itself. And you, watching now, must understand this. These are not mere stories of the past. They are the mechanisms by which power maintains its dominion. They are the same patterns at work today, hidden in institutions, in culture, in what you are taught to accept without question. The second child did not arrive as births are meant to arrive. There was no natural rhythm to it, no predictable pain, no orderly progression that midwives recognized. Weeks passed after Eliza's birth, and Margaret remained visibly pregnant, her body refusing to obey the rules of biology. The town doctor declared it impossible, a medical absurdity, and yet Margaret's womb continued to carry life, another presence, heavier, denser, as though anchored to something far beyond 1837. When the labor finally began, it was not pain that seized Margaret first, but memory. Not her own memories, but fragments forced into her mind, images of iron railroads slicing through forests, factories breathing smoke into the sky, men speaking of electricity as if it were a new god. She saw uniforms she did not recognize, weapons she had never seen, and crowds moving with a speed and obedience unknown to her century. This was not imagination. This was intrusion. The second twin emerged in silence. No immediate cry. No frantic breath. The room itself seemed to recoil, the air thickening as if reality hesitated to accept what had crossed through. The child's skin bore a faint bluish hue, not of sickness, but of unfamiliarity. His eyes opened slowly, focusing not on faces, but on objects, corners of the room, shadows along the walls, places where time itself felt thin. They named him Thomas, but the name did not fit him. Margaret sensed it immediately. This child carried the weight of another era, one shaped by systems not yet built and rules not yet enforced. He did not gaze with wonder, like Eliza. He observed, calculated. When he cried, it was brief and restrained, as if emotion itself was something learned rather than instinctive. Within days, the watchers returned, no longer subtle, no longer cautious. They questioned the doctor, silenced the midwives, and sealed Margaret's home under the guise of health concerns. Curtains were drawn, letters intercepted, neighbors warned away. What had once been curiosity hardened into containment. The second child had crossed a threshold that could not be ignored. Margaret realized then that her role was no longer that of a mother alone. She had become a gatekeeper. One child tied to the future by vision, the other forged by it, shaped by systems of control, hierarchy, and obedience that had not yet been named. Together, the twins represented something far more threatening than prophecy. They were proof that time could be accessed, manipulated, and weaponized. And those in power understood this better than anyone. Because if time itself could be breached, then authority, past, present, and future, was no longer secure. This was not an accident of nature. It was an exposure. And the response had already begun. From the moment Thomas opened his eyes, the world shifted around him. Ordinary objects seemed to hum with meaning. The furniture in Margaret's modest home, the wooden rocking chair, the iron stove, the rough-hewn floorboards, each held a resonance, a significance that defied explanation. The elite watchers, those shadowed figures who had infiltrated every corner of her life, recognized it immediately. They realized the boy was not simply a child. He was a vessel of forbidden knowledge, a living node where past, present, and future collided. Margaret noticed it first in subtle ways. He could anticipate events before they occurred. A candle would flicker moments before a draft arrived. The family dog would bark in response to a presence no one else could perceive. And worst of all, Thomas seemed aware of the watchers, not merely seeing them, but understanding their intentions, predicting their maneuvers. The child's mind operated on a level the adults around him could scarcely grasp. By now, Margaret's home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a theater of surveillance. Every visitor was measured, every interaction scrutinized. And yet, she felt a strange paradox. The twins had become her protection as much as her burden. Eliza, with her prophetic awareness, offered glimpses of danger before it struck. Thomas, with his impossible comprehension of systems yet to exist, offered insight into the mechanics of manipulation itself. Together, they formed a lattice of perception that defied the careful control exerted by the shadowed authorities. But the forces watching Margaret were relentless. Men cloaked in the legitimacy of science, clergy armed with moral authority, and lawmen convinced of their civic duty, all converged on her home, attempting to categorize, to define, to control. They came not to protect, but to dominate. They sought to enforce the rules of time, to stamp out the anomaly that Thomas represented, and to neutralize the unpredictable potential of Eliza's visions. And Margaret, exhausted, terrified, and yet unbroken, realized something profound. She had become a target not because of anything she had done, but because she had become the guardian of truths too dangerous for ordinary eyes. She held the key to the control of reality itself. And in that key lay both immense power and unspeakable peril. Even now, as you listen, understand this. The mechanisms at work in Margaret Whitmore's life are not relics of a forgotten century. They are the same patterns that govern hidden power today. Subtle manipulation, control of perception, the suppression of knowledge. The twins were the focal point of these forces, but they were also the embodiment of resistance, of insight, of awareness that threatens the carefully constructed illusions of authority. And so, the descent continues. You are witnessing not just the story of two children, but the revelation of a system that has always existed, waiting for those brave enough to perceive it. The Watchers did not operate with brute force alone. Their methods were subtler, more insidious, designed to erode Margaret's mind without leaving evidence of coercion. Letters would arrive, unsigned, containing instructions she did not understand. Notes would appear on her doorstep, written in code she had never learned, yet somehow understood. Dreams became instruments of control. One night, Margaret awoke to find herself standing at the edge of a frozen river, feeling the pull of an unseen current, only to realize the vision had come from the Watchers, an attempt to manipulate her perception of reality itself. They studied her, the twins, and the dynamics of her household with relentless precision. Each cough, each hesitation, each glance at a shadowed corner of the room was noted, interpreted, filed. Their ultimate goal was clear. They were not interested in nurturing these children. They sought to break her, to bend her will, to co-opt the anomaly for their own gain. And the moment they perceived weakness, they would strike decisively. Margaret, however, was learning to fight in ways the Watchers had not anticipated. She discovered that the twins themselves could serve as guides through the psychological labyrinth. Eliza's visions offered warnings, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in overwhelming clarity. Thomas's strange awareness allowed her to anticipate manipulations, to see traps before they were sprung. The children had become extensions of her own perception, tools of survival and insight in a world designed to suppress them. It was during this period of tense observation that Margaret realized the scope of the forces arrayed against her. The elite networks that had been invisible for centuries were present now in her modest Pennsylvania home. Their reach extended into medicine, law, religion, and even education. Each institution had been designed not merely to save society, but to control it, to channel knowledge, to suppress anomalies. Margaret understood, in a moment of stark clarity, that her children were the ultimate threat to this system, living evidence that the carefully constructed narrative of reality was incomplete, manipulated, and vulnerable. And yet, the danger was not abstract. One night, a stranger arrived at the house, a man with eyes too sharp, a voice too smooth, carrying the air of someone who had mastered the art of fey. He spoke not with threats, but with certainty, explaining that the twins represented an unstable point in time, a fracture that could be exploited, harnessed, or destroyed. He offered Margaret a choice, but she understood immediately that there was no real choice. To resist would be to invite annihilation. To comply would be to surrender what she loved most. As you hear this, understand, the mechanisms of control Margaret faced are not relics of the 19th century. They are alive today, operating invisibly, shaping perception, manipulating outcomes, and silencing those who perceived too much. The twins were not simply children. They were a mirror reflecting the true power dynamics that govern reality. And now, you are beginning to see what the Watchers feared most: awareness. The descent has deepened. The rabbit hole widens, and you can no longer turn away. The first fracture in time revealed itself without spectacle. No thunder, no light, just absence, brief, precise, terrifying. One morning, Margaret woke to find Eliza standing at the window, staring at a landscape that was not there. Her lips moved, quietly counting. When Margaret asked what she saw, Eliza answered with unsettling calm. Places that had not been built yet, men who spoke into small black mirrors, roads that glowed at night. Then, just as suddenly, the vision collapsed. Eliza swayed, exhausted, as if she had returned from a long journey no body should survive. That same day, Thomas did something far more dangerous. He rearranged objects in the home, not randomly, but with deliberate structure. Books aligned by a logic Margaret could not follow. Chairs positioned at angles that made no sense. When she tried to correct it, Thomas stopped her, placing his hand on hers with a firmness no child should possess. He shook his head once. Later that night, a watcher arrived unannounced, stood exactly where one chair had been placed, and slipped on the uneven floorboards Thomas had accounted for. The accident was dismissed. Margaret did not dismiss it. This was the moment she understood the truth they were hiding. Eliza perceived time. Thomas manipulated outcomes within it. One saw what could be. The other adjusted what would be. Together, they formed a closed loop: vision and execution, the very foundation of power itself. This was not prophecy. This was system control. The watches escalated immediately. New faces appeared. New language. The tone shifted from observation to urgency. Meetings were held in rooms Margaret was not allowed to enter. She overheard fragments, words like containment, replication, future leverage. They were no longer afraid of the twins. They were hungry. And here lies the hidden truth most men never realize. Institutions do not fear chaos. They fear competition. The twins represented an unauthorized command over reality itself. Not belief. Not religion. Not myth. Function. Control. Precision. Margaret felt the pressure increase. Food deliveries changed. Sleep became fractured. Even her thoughts felt crowded, as if something were testing the edges of her mind, mapping her resistance. Psychological control was tightening, slowly, methodically, designed to make surrender feel like relief. But the twins adapted faster than the system expected. Eliza began speaking less, conserving her visions. Thomas learned silence, watching patterns, studying people the way men study machines. They were evolving, not as children, but as instruments. And if this unsettles you, it should. Because this is the part of history they never teach. Power does not emerge from violence alone. It emerges from understanding systems before they are named. The twins were ahead of their time, literally, and those who rule could not allow that to continue unchecked. By the 7th month, silence became Margaret's greatest enemy. Not the absence of sound, but enforced quiet, the kind imposed when truth grows too dangerous to speak. The watchers had learned that observation alone was insufficient. Control required isolation. Neighbors were warned away under threat of fines and moral accusation. Clergy stopped visiting. Even the mail ceased. Margaret and the twins were being erased in plain sight, not through imprisonment, but through disappearance from collective awareness. This was the oldest tactic of power. If a truth cannot be destroyed, it is buried beneath absence. Men forget what they are never allowed to see. And in forgetting, systems remain intact. Inside the house, time itself began to misbehave. Clocks drifted. Candles burned unevenly. Margaret noticed that hours stretched or collapsed depending on where Thomas sat today. When he slept, time felt normal. When he watched, it tightened, efficient, compressed, purposeful. Eliza, meanwhile, grew increasingly withdrawn, her visions becoming heavier, darker. She no longer described cities or inventions. She spoke of councils, sealed rooms, and men who believed they were eternal because their names never appeared in books. One night, Eliza broke her silence. She told Margaret something no mother should hear. She said the watchers were not acting alone. They never had. They were inheritors, keepers of a framework passed down through centuries, refined through empires, religions, and revolutions. Their task was simple: regulate deviation. Time anomalies were not new. They were rare, but known. And every one of them had been neutralized, redirected, or absorbed into the system. Margaret finally understood the true danger. The twins were not anomalies because they existed. They were anomalies because they existed together. Vision without action could be dismissed as madness. Action without foresight could be labeled coincidence. But combined, they created something unmanageable, a sovereign intelligence operating outside institutional permission. The Watchers prepared their final psychological weapon: authority disguised as rescue. Papers were drafted, medical terms fabricated, a narrative constructed where Margaret would be remembered not as a witness, but as a malfunction. History would not record suppression. It would record treatment. And here's the part that matters to you. This is the mechanism still used today. When a man sees too clearly, he is not attacked directly. He is reframed, diagnosed, labeled. His credibility is dismantled before his ideas are ever addressed. Margaret sensed the trap closing. She began planning, not escape, but fracture. If the system demanded order, she would introduce controlled chaos, not to destroy power, but to confuse it. Because systems fail not when opposed, but when confronted with something they cannot categorize. And the twins were about to become uncategorizable. Margaret stopped thinking like a mother and began thinking like a strategist. Survival was no longer about protection. It was about misdirection. She understood now that resistance invited correction, but unpredictability created hesitation. And hesitation, within rigid systems, was weakness. She began altering routines in subtle ways. Meals at irregular hours. Lights extinguished early, then lit again deep into the night. She spoke aloud to herself deliberately, mixing truth with fabrication, knowing the Watchers listened even when unseen. If her mind became unreadable, their models would fail. If her behavior contradicted itself, their projections would fracture. Thomas noticed immediately. He adjusted. Where once he optimized outcomes, he now introduced noise. Small inefficiencies. Minor disruptions. A cup placed slightly off-center. A door left partially ajar. Not mistakes, variables. Eliza, meanwhile, withdrew further inward. Her visions no longer spontaneous but summoned deliberately, as if she were learning to navigate time rather than be dragged through it. What the Watchers did not anticipate was adaptation from within the anomaly. Their framework was designed to manage static deviations, not evolving ones. They believed power flowed one way, from institution to subject. They had never accounted for recursive awareness, the moment when the observed understands the observer. Documents began to contradict one another. Orders overlapped. Authority blurred. One faction wanted extraction. Another wanted erasure. A third argued preservation. The system stalled under its own weight. And in that stall, Margaret felt something dangerous and intoxicating. Leverage. Eliza revealed a vision that changed everything. She described a future room filled with glass and light, where men argued over numbers, probabilities, and acceptable losses. On a table lay records, Margaret's name reduced to symbols, her children classified not as human, but as assets. The decision, Eliza said, would hinge on one variable: compliance. Thomas understood the implication instantly. If compliance was expected, then refusal alone would alter the timeline. Not rebellion, not violence, just non-participation. Systems built on control cannot function without consent, even coerced consent. Margaret made her choice. She would not run. She would not plead. She would become inert to manipulation, emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally. The Watchers would find nothing to push against. No fear to amplify. No desperation to exploit. This is a truth most men never learn. Power feeds on reaction. Deny it reaction, and it begins consuming itself. By the end of that week, the house felt different. Quieter, but sharper. As if reality itself were holding its breath. The twins no longer behaved like children. They behaved like thresholds. And thresholds are dangerous places for systems that depend on continuity. It was then that the Watchers changed tactics entirely. They stopped approaching Margaret directly. They no longer knocked on doors, whispered through letters, or orchestrated minor disruptions. Instead, they began to manipulate perception itself, infiltrating every interaction, every conversation, every fleeting thought. Margaret would catch fragments of conversations in the streets, neighbors murmuring with exact words she had just thought. A candle would flicker before a sound even reached her ears. Shadows moved differently in the corners of rooms. The house itself became a hole of mirrors, where reality bent in ways that were almost imperceptible, but profoundly unsettling. Margaret realized that the system did not merely want compliance. It wanted confusion. It wanted the mind to fracture so thoroughly that the anomaly, the twins, could be absorbed, neutralized, and reproposed. Knowledge, after all, is dangerous only when it is understood. Misperception is the most effective form of control, and she was watching her own reality twist into a trap designed to make her doubt every instinct, every perception, every heartbeat. But she had already begun to transcend ordinary fey. Margaret noticed patterns the watchers believed were invisible. A repetition in their arrival, the subtle cadence of their words, the timing of the smallest movements, and she began leaving traces, not as messages for herself, but as signals to the twins. Eliza responded with whispered phrases that revealed outcomes not yet realized. Thomas acted, shifting objects, adjusting the environment, manipulating probabilities in ways the watchers could neither predict nor understand. It was then that Margaret understood the true weapon of the children. Not their temporal displacement, not their uncanny perception, but the space they created between observation and action, a gap where unpredictability thrived. The watchers, masters of influence and authority, could not control what could not be modeled. The house became a battlefield of perception. Every gesture, every sound, every pause carried meaning. The watchers advanced, retreated, recalculated, but they could not anticipate the twins' recursive logic. Each step forward triggered subtle but irreversible feedback. Every intervention became an opportunity for exposure, a chance to unmask their methods. And this is the crucial point, the truth buried in centuries of history. The strongest form of power is invisible, omnipresent, and unchallengeable only when met with obedience. But once awareness enters the equation, the machinery falters. Margaret felt it in her bones. The watchers were uneasy. They had underestimated the recursive consciousness of her children. And in that unease, she discovered her own agency. The descent grows darker from here. What you are about to witness is no longer a struggle of mother and child, but a confrontation between temporal anomaly and the architecture of control itself. The first irreversible fracture did not announce itself as rebellion. It arrived disguised as normalcy. A routine inspection. A scheduled visit. A familiar pattern the watchers believed they controlled. That assumption would cost them more than they understood. Thomas had learned the architecture of their system by observing its blind spots. He noticed how authority relied on expectation, how procedures assumed cooperation, how power moved fastest when resistance behaved predictably. So he did not resist. He complied precisely where it mattered least, and disrupted everything else. When the watchers entered the house that morning, nothing seemed wrong. The air was calm. Margaret was composed. Eliza sat quietly, eyes lowered. Thomas stood still, hands folded. The men relaxed. Their confidence returned. This was the danger point, the moment when systems lower their guard because compliance has been visually confirmed. Eliza had already seen this moment. She knew exactly how it ended in one timeline: separation, documentation, erasure. But she had also seen another outcome, narrow, unstable, but real. One where a single variable altered the sequence irreversibly. That variable was timing. As the lead watcher reached for his notebook, Thomas moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, but deliberately. He shifted one chair a few inches backward. That was all. A meaningless gesture to anyone not trained in systems. But the floorboard beneath the chair had been weakened months earlier by a leak no one recorded. The chair collapsed. The man fell. The notebook slid across the floor and opened. Margaret saw what she was never meant to see. Names, dates, symbols marking other anomalies, other people, catalogued across decades. Some entries were crossed out, some labeled resolved, some mark absorbed. There was no chaos in the list, only efficiency. The watchers froze. Authority depends on information asymmetry. The moment the subject sees the ledger, power shifts. Not fully, not safely, but enough. Eliza spoke then, not to the men, but to the system behind them. She recited a future consequence with surgical calm. She described hearings that would never happen, reports that would be buried, internal fractures that would widen because of what occurred in this room. She was not threatening. She was informing. The watchers understood immediately. This was no longer containment. This was exposure risk. And systems fear exposure more than rebellion. They left without finishing their inspection. No orders. No explanations. Just retreat. That day marked the first failure in a framework that had survived empires. And failures, once recorded, propagate. Margaret understood the implication as night fell. The twins had crossed a line. Not into power, but into leverage. And once leverage exists, the system must either adapt or eliminate. That night, silence became a language. Margaret could feel it pressing against her, dense and deliberate, carrying the weight of things unsaid. The watchers did not retain, not because they had abandoned the field, but because they were recalibrating. Systems do not act recklessly. They pause, model outcomes, and choose the path of least resistance. Margaret knew this instinctively. Eliza, curled against her side, whispered fragments of visions that seemed like riddles at first. Corridors of light that did not exist, men with faces obscured by masks, clocks that moved backward while the world outside pressed forward. Margaret understood immediately. These were warnings. Not for her, but for the system. The twins were not merely observers, they were agents capable of creating alternative outcomes, subtle divergences that compounded into chaos. Thomas sat across the room, eyes tracking shadows. He did not speak, yet his presence alone distorted the room. Candles flickered toward him, shadows bent in impossible ways, and objects in his vicinity seemed to resist their natural positions. Margaret realized then that he had evolved beyond prediction. He no longer responded to stimuli. He anticipated them. And the watchers, somewhere beyond the walls of her home, were beginning to sense the fracture. Their confidence had been measured, calibrated, absolute. Now, hesitation seeped into their ranks. Reports conflicted. Orders reversed themselves. Internal debates spiraled into indecision. They were facing not just an anomaly, but a recursive problem. A system capable of observing their own strategies and neutralizing them without direct confrontation. Margaret recognized the paradox. Power is built to control, but only where awareness is incomplete. The moment a subject perceives the mechanisms of control, those mechanisms weaken. Awareness is a vector. Observation becomes leverage. And leverage, once gained, cannot easily be relinquished. By the small hours, the twins had retreated into their own space, Eliza focusing inward, Thomas scanning outward. Margaret, alone with her thoughts, felt the intensity of what they represented. Not children, not miracles, not monsters. Thresholds, conduits, catalysts. And here's the lesson most men will never learn. The moment you perceive the hidden patterns that shape reality, you gain power simply by refusing ignorance. That is what Margaret, Eliza, and Thomas had discovered. They had not yet acted overtly, yet their mere understanding had begun to unravel centuries of structured control. The night stretched long, heavy, and electric. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious. Inside, history was bending, quietly, inevitably, toward an outcome no one, not even the watchers, could fully anticipate. Dawn arrived like a question. Light slanted through frost-coated windows, sharp and revealing, as if the world itself sought to test the boundaries of perception. Margaret noticed first that the house felt different, not because of anything she had done, but because the twins had begun projecting influence beyond the walls. Eliza's whispered visions had stretched into reality, nudging probabilities, bending minor events in ways imperceptible to ordinary observers. Thomas, seated by the hearth, extended the first outward-reaching manipulation. Not a movement, not a word, but a focus. Objects across town, a horse-cat, a shopkeeper's ledger, a passing pedestrian, shifted slightly in sequence, creating tiny ripples that multiplied without anyone noticing. Margaret watched, her breath caught, as the system, the watcher's network of influence, observation, and control, reacted. Not visibly, but in the patterns of human behavior she had begun to read instinctively. The watcher's response was immediate. Messages arrived through intermediaries. Letters, official inquiries, and visits framed as concern. Yet each contained subtle directives: monitor, assess, contain, neutralize. Every action they took was calibrated to anticipate normal human behavior, But Thomas and Eliza were no longer constrained by the normal. Their cognition, their awareness, moved outside the predictable range. Eliza spoke to Margaret in fragmented phrases that made no immediate sense. Time bends at corners you do not see. Watch the blacksmith. The ledger will misalign. Listen to the wind. Margaret followed these cryptic instructions, and by midday, small anomalies multiplied. A falling bucket avoided a child in the street. A horse bolted in a pattern that prevented collision. Minuscule, accidental? No, intentional. The twins were learning influence, direct and indirect, without intervention from Margaret. And here lies the hidden truth few ever acknowledge. When the perception of control is breached, the system begins to destabilize not through aggression, but through uncertainty. Authority requires predictability, compliance, submission. Once an unpredictable vector exists, all planning fractures. Every report, every assumption, every manipulation becomes suspect. By evening, the watchers themselves were in disarray. Factions argued over protocol. Some suggested extraction. Others feared exposure. Still others advocated containment through extreme measures. Margaret realized that the very hierarchy that had controlled her life for months was now under the influence of her children's actions. And you, listening now, must understand this. The twins' ability to manipulate the edges of reality is more than story. It is allegory. Systems fear perception more than open rebellion. Awareness is the ultimate weapon, and once it is active, no authority can fully predict the outcome. The descent continues. The twins are no longer passive. The watchers are no longer confident. And the threads of history are beginning to unravel in ways no one was ever meant to see. Margaret began to see patterns not as random chaos, but as deliberate architecture. Every shift, every anomaly, every subtle bend in reality was a signal, a message encoded in the universe itself. Eliza and Thomas were not merely surviving. They were communicating with forces beyond comprehension, translating the language of time into acts perceptible to those awake enough to notice. Margaret understood that the watchers were terrified not by strength or numbers, but by comprehension. Awareness could not be contained, only delayed. That night, she spoke to the twins about the world outside their walls, the invisible machinery of influence that stretched across towns, counties, and even continents. These systems, she whispered, are designed to bend men into submission. But the moment you see the gears turning, you hold the option to resist. Thomas looked at her, understanding more than a child should, and Eliza's eyes flickered with visions of timelines folding like paper. And here's where you must participate. Awareness is not passive. True perception demands acknowledgement. For those listening, repeat this phrase silently, or aloud, twice. I see what was hidden. Say it once. Let it resonate. Say it again. Let it anchor. This is not ritual. It is declaration. Identity is formed through recognition. Awareness is solidified through acknowledgement. The watchers, even then, were recalculating. They had assumed that knowledge could be contained in silence and isolation. They had failed to anticipate the recursive nature of perception. The moment the observed understands the observer, control falters. Margaret realized the twins were not only changing their immediate reality, they were shifting the perception of everyone who bore witness. Eliza described a corridor of mirrors that reflected potential outcomes. Every choice the watchers made now branched into multiple consequences simultaneously. Thomas, meanwhile, adjusted variables in the real world, subtle but precise, creating divergences that could never be reversed once observed. Margaret felt the tension in the house thicken. The air itself seemed alive, charged with probabilities. This was the turning point. For months, the watchers had believed themselves untouchable. Now, even without physical confrontation, their authority was cracking. Decisions delayed. Orders misaligned. Panic contained behind polished facades. Margaret knew the twins were reaching beyond simple observation. They were assating influence. And you, hearing this now, must understand. Awareness changes the trajectory of reality. Systems fear perception because it cannot be ignored, suppressed, or quantified. The twins are a lesson in this principle. Their existence proves that the moment a man, or a mind, truly perceives hidden structures, he gains the power to disrupt them. The descent deepens. From this point forward, nothing will remain the same. Not for Margaret, not for the twins, not for the watchers, and not for those brave enough to see. The watcher's confidence began to fracture visibly. Subtle at first, a hesitation in a gesture, a miscalculated instruction, but then more pronounced. Margaret noticed it in the way they approached the house, in the tone of their letters, in the careful avoidance of certain rooms. They had underestimated the twins, but they were beginning to realize the depth of their miscalculation. The anomaly they sought to control had learned to anticipate, manipulate, and outmaneuver. Margaret began to act deliberately, using the twins as instruments of strategy. She instructed Eliza to focus her visions on points of leverage, locations, schedules, individuals whose movements could destabilize the watcher's network. Thomas learned to translate these visions into physical adjustments, moving objects, creating delays, introducing errors in the watcher's routines. Together, mother and children transformed their home into a hub of subtle but unstoppable influence. The system that had seemed so omnipotent became brittle. Each intervention multiplied uncertainty. The watchers could no longer rely on assumption. Each predictable path they had counted on was now a potential trap. Margaret realized the magnitude of what they were achieving. Not overt rebellion, not violent confrontation, but recursive disruption. They were bending the system from within, using awareness and observation as weapons more powerful than any authority. The psychological pressure on the watchers intensified. Some withdrew entirely, unwilling to risk exposure. Others argued over protocol, exposing weaknesses in communication and hierarchy. Still others doubled down, attempting extreme interventions that only created additional instability. Margaret watched it all unfold, understanding a truth few ever recognize. Those in power are terrified of variables they cannot predict, and the moment a single variable operates outside their control, the illusion of omnipotence crumbles. It was during this time that Margaret began preparing the twins for a broader understanding. She taught them not merely to act, but to anticipate. Not merely to observe, but to interpret the invisible threads of influence that shaped every interaction, every system, every decision. Eliza focused on perception and insight, Thomas on timing and execution. Together, they became a recursive feedback loop, extending influence across space and time in ways the watchers could neither anticipate nor prevent. And here's the lesson hidden in plain sight. Authority does not fear power. It fears comprehension. Systems do not fail from aggression, but from recognition. The twins were proof of this principle, thresholds of perception capable of bending reality simply by existing, observing, and acting strategically. Margaret, watching her children, understood the profound danger they represented, not just to the watchers, but to the very structure of control itself. And she knew that the deeper they went into this knowledge, the more irreversible the fracture would become. The watchers regrouped, no longer acting individually, no longer relying on fragmented observation, they coordinated. Meetings in shadowed rooms, coded letters, and silent messengers stretched across counties. Their objective was clear: neutralize the anomaly before it could propagate further. They would not risk another fracture in their systems. Margaret understood immediately that escalation had begun. But this time, the twins were ready. Eliza's visions had grown sharper, her perception of temporal and systemic patterns expanding. She could predict their moves hours, even days in advance, identifying the precise nodes where interference would be most effective. Thomas translated these visions into action with unerring precision. He positioned objects, created delays, and subtly altered sequences of events in ways that made the watcher strategies collapse without anyone suspecting deliberate interference. The first clash came quietly. A messenger intended to deliver a coded warning was intercepted, but Thomas had already anticipated it. A shifted book, a moved chair, a slight delay in Margaret's departure caused the messenger to miscalculate, redirecting the information entirely into a dead end. The watchers recorded failure, frustration building, but they could not locate the variable. To them, reality itself was rebelling. Margaret recognized the significance. Systems designed to control are fragile when confronted with unpredictability compounded by foresight. Every act by the twins, though small in isolation, created cascading failures. Authority relied on expectation, repetition, and predictability. These elements no longer existed within Margaret's home. Each calculated intervention became a ripple, each ripple multiplied by observation, each multiplication destabilizing centuries of embedded control. And yet, the watchers did not relent. They increased their pressure, sending more envoys, deploying intricate plans to coerce, cajole, or intimidate. Letters carried. Threats disguised as advice. Clergy visited under the guise of concern. Authorities scrutinized financial records, local property claims, and social networks. Margaret saw the outlines of their strategy. Overwhelm the mind, force compliance through distraction and subtle psychological assault. But the twins' response evolved faster than the system could calculate. Eliza projected perception beyond the home. She visualized patterns, potentialities, human behaviors not yet enacted. Thomas manipulated tangible variables, ensuring the system's next move failed before it could begin. Together, they created feedback loops the watchers could not comprehend, let alone control. This was no longer a simple anomaly. It was a lesson in awareness, strategy, and the raw power of perception. Margaret understood a fundamental truth. The strongest forms of power are invisible, recursive, and uncontainable. And when awareness meets control, the outcome is always unpredictable, and often irreversible. Margaret realized the twins' influence need not be confined to the walls of their home. The fractures they created in perception and reality could ripple outward, affecting events beyond the town, even beyond the county. It was no longer about survival. It was about strategy. Observation alone was no longer sufficient. Deliberate action could create shifts that authority could neither anticipate nor contain. Eliza, focusing inward, visualized human behavior across space and time, mapping probabilities with precision. She saw patterns, meetings that would be missed, decisions delayed, routines disrupted, without touching a single person physically. Margaret watched, understanding that this was the power of perception itself, a subtle yet unbreakable force that could reroute consequences before they manifested. Thomas acted to translate these visions into reality. Small adjustments, objects, timings, positions, rippled outward, altering the environment in ways invisible to ordinary observation but catastrophic to the watcher's expectations. A single horse misdirected, a ledger delivered late, a letter left unopened for hours. Each minor shift compounded, and the system faltered. Even the most experienced watchers could not trace the source. Authority relied on linear control, and they were encountering a multi-layered feedback loop beyond their comprehension. Margaret began to coordinate with the twins consciously. Every day, every movement, every act of observation became a calculated engagement with unseen forces. They were no longer passive anomalies. They were instruments of disruption. Authority itself had become the observed variable, and the twins, by instinct, by evolution, by necessity, were rewriting the rules of engagement. Then came the first tangible consequence outside the home. A council meeting convened by the watchers collapsed due to miscommunications the twins had engineered. A courier dispatched to observe Margaret returned with contradictory reports. Plans executed meticulously over decades failed in hours. Margaret understood the significance. Once perception intersects with strategy, systems dependent on obedience falter. Predictability is the lifeblood of control, and the twins were draining it. And this is where the lesson sharpens for you. Awareness is not passive. Understanding the hidden mechanisms of power is not enough. Observation must be paired with action, deliberate, subtle, recursive action. That is how leverage is created. That is how the invisible becomes unstoppable. Margaret, watching the chaos ripple outward, understood that the watchers were beginning to fear not just the twins, but the principles they embodied. Comprehension without fear, strategy without interference, perception operating beyond the reach of authority. This was a threshold no institution could withstand for long. The descent deepens. The twins are no longer just observers or participants, they are catalysts. And the system that once ruled unchallenged is beginning to bend under their influence. The watchers recognized that subtle manipulation was no longer sufficient. The anomalies had become too complex, too adaptive. They escalated to psychological coercion, a tactic designed to break resistance through fear, doubt, and exhaustion. Letters now carried veiled threats of ruin, property loss, and social disgrace. Emissaries arrived under the guise of friendship, counsel, and civic responsibility. Every word, every gesture, was calculated to induce compliance, to make Margaret and the twins doubt themselves. But Margaret understood their strategy. Authority always seeks to exploit the predictable human response to fear. She had prepared for this. She had taught the twins to anticipate patterns, to recognize the invisible pressures, and to act in ways that made the watchers' assumptions collapse. When an emissary arrived with a carefully measured smile, Thomas subtly shifted objects in the room, changing angles, shadows, and lines of sight. The messenger, trained to read context, hesitated, misjudged, and retreated without ever realizing why. Eliza, meanwhile, focused inward, interpreting timelines in which each threat could unfold. She predicted outcomes before they happened, selecting the one that minimized risk and maximized disruption. Every attempt at coercion by the Watchers became an opportunity for leverage. A misstep here, a misjudged gesture there, and entire plans failed, unraveling their networks from within. Margaret began to perceive the larger truth. The Watcher's power was fragile because it relied on obedience. Once obedience faltered, every protocol, every procedure, every assumption became a liability. Authority depends not on moral right, but on compliance. And when compliance is replaced by awareness, it begins to implode silently, without spectacle, without overt confrontation. The twins had become architects of this collapse. Their interventions were precise, invisible, and unstoppable, not through force, but through the manipulation of perception, timing, and probability. Margaret watched as the system she had feared for months began to betray itself. As divisions emerged, communications failed, and certainty dissolved into chaos. And this is the lesson hidden in Margaret's story. The most dangerous knowledge is the knowledge of systems, the ability to perceive them, anticipate them, and disrupt them without direct confrontation. Awareness is a weapon far sharper than any physical force. Insight is a leverage point the powerful cannot guard against. By the time night fell, the Watchers' coordinated intervention had failed entirely. Their strategies, once infallible, were fragmented and unreliable. Margaret understood that the twins had reached a level of influence that could not be contained. The system itself was bending, reshaping around them, and they were no longer merely surviving. They were asserting dominance in the realm of perception and control. By now, Margaret realized that the Watchers were not acting in isolation. They were part of a network older and broader than she had imagined, a lattice of influence woven across generations, continents, and institutions. The twins had exposed the edges of this hidden architecture, and the cracks were widening. Letters intercepted, visitors rebuffed, alliances subtly undermined. All were signals of panic moving through a system designed to suppress anomalies efficiently. Eliza began to perceive the deeper agendas. She spoke in fragmented sentences, describing councils convened in shadowed rooms, archives filled with knowledge that could destabilize governments, rituals maintained for centuries to maintain compliance. The Watchers were not merely observers, they were guardians of a structure designed to manage human perception itself. Margaret listened, horrified and fascinated. The children were revealing the skeleton of control that had always lurked beneath polite society, beneath law, education, and religion. Thomas acted in concert. He adjusted sequences, altered probabilities, and created disruptions in the everyday world. Misplaced objects, delayed arrivals, misaligned schedules, small, almost imperceptible acts with cascading consequences. The Watchers, attempting to coordinate their response across the sprawling network, found their strategies unraveling. Decisions contradicted each other. Protocols failed. Authority, which relies on consistency, began to falter under its own weight. Margaret understood the significance. The twins were not just surviving attempts at control. They were actively destabilizing the hidden system. Their influence reached beyond immediate perception, impacting nodes of power and communication the Watchers assumed untouchable. The network had no defense for recursive awareness. And hey, for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to see the larger picture. The children were conduits, thresholds through which suppressed knowledge, forbidden agendas, and hidden manipulations could be observed and disrupted. They were teaching her a principle that few had ever understood. Systems are vulnerable not at their strongest point, but at the interface between observation and action, at the gap where comprehension intersects with decision. For the Watchers, this was terrifying. They had built their authority on obedience and predictability. The twins had introduced neither fear nor chaos. They had introduced insight. Insight that multiplied in unpredictable directions, feeding on anticipation, collapsing assumptions, and forcing recalibration across centuries of accumulated control. And now, Margaret realized something extraordinary. This was no longer a story confined to her home, to Pennsylvania, or even to 1837. The twins were demonstrating a principle that could transform perception itself, that awareness, when paired with subtle action, could bend systems, unravel control, and expose the hidden workings of history. Margaret realized the next step had to be deliberate. Survival alone was no longer enough. The twins' abilities had revealed the cracks in the Watcher's network, but now those cracks could be exploited to force irreversible consequences. Knowledge had to be weaponized. Perception had to become leverage. The line between observation and action blurred into strategy. Eliza focused on patterns, scanning behaviors, projecting probable outcomes, and identifying points where the Watcher's network would inevitably fail. Her visions were no longer passive glimpses. They were directives, precise instructions encoded in thought, timing, and sequence. Thomas translated these visions into reality. A ledger shifted, a courier redirected, a decision postponed. Seemingly inconsequential actions multiplied into cascading failures across the network. Each ripple further destabilized the system without revealing its source. Margaret coordinated with them, guiding subtle interventions, letters sent with cryptic notes, objects repositioned, events nudged into misalignment. Every action carried the weight of insight, not force. Authority had no defense against this. It relied on expectation, on the assumption that deviation would be punished or corrected. The twins had removed the assumption entirely. The Watchers reacted predictably. Panic seeped into their communication. Their coordination faltered. Factions arose over conflicting strategies. Some argued for extraction, others for containment, others for elimination, but all misread the nature of the twins' influence. They assumed visible measures could control invisible manipulation. They assumed that threat could be applied linearly to a system operating recursively. Margaret understood the lesson her children were teaching. Awareness, when coupled with subtle, deliberate action, is a weapon stronger than armies. The twins had not needed to confront authority physically. They had simply become impossible to contain. Every misstep the Watchers took was now a direct consequence of their own assumptions, their own reliance on predictability, their own failure to account for consciousness operating beyond their models. By nightfall, the network of observation, the invisible web that had spanned decades, was visibly fraying. Plans could no longer be executed. Communication broke down. Orders were misinterpreted or ignored. And through it all, the twins continued to operate quietly, efficiently, invisibly, thresholds bending the flow of events around them, untraceable, unstoppable. And here's the essential truth. Systems fear awareness more than rebellion, insight more than chaos. Observation, paired with subtle, calculated action, produces fractures no authority can fully repair. Margaret had realized it. The twins embodied it. And if you are listening now, you must understand it too. The power of perception, when deliberately applied, cannot be contained. Margaret understood that mere survival was no longer the goal. The twins had become instruments capable of exposing the very foundation of the Watcher's network. Every subtle adjustment, every prediction, every intervention revealed truths long buried, agendas that had persisted for centuries, hidden behind layers of authority, ritual, and bureaucracy. These were the secrets that maintained control, the coded mechanisms that ensured obedience, and now, the twins could illuminate them. Eliza's vision sharpened, reaching farther than Margaret had ever imagined. She began seeing entire nodes of influence, the councils, the archives, the secret rooms where decisions were made that shaped lives and histories no one was aware of. The Watchers were terrified of exposure, and the twins' perception was perfect precision. Even the smallest anomaly became evidence of systemic manipulation. Margaret realized the power in this. Insight alone could fracture empires if wielded correctly. Thomas began to translate these visions into the real world. A ledger misplaced in one town, a courier misrouted, a meeting delayed. Each act appeared accidental but was deliberate, creating cascading disruptions in the Watcher's operations. Authority depended on predictability, and every deviation introduced doubt. Even minor inconsistencies became amplified through the network, destabilizing decision-making processes. The Watchers escalated again, deploying complex strategies designed to regain control. Yet every intervention was anticipated. Every calculated move neutralized. Margaret observed as entire factions within the network began to contradict one another. Confusion spread like a virus. The system that had seemed infallible was now vulnerable, because it had failed to account for an intelligence operating recursively, aware of both observation and manipulation. Margaret realized the true lesson. Control is never absolute. It relies on compliance, on the assumption that the observed will react predictably. The twins had removed predictability. They had removed assumption. And in doing so, they revealed the fragile underpinnings of authority itself. And here's where the revelation sharpens for you. Hidden systems of power, no matter how elaborate, crumble when exposed to awareness combined with subtle, deliberate action. Margaret and her children were proof that perception is more powerful than enforcement, and insight more dangerous than force. By nightfall, the Watcher's network was unraveling in ways no one could contain. Orders were ignored, factions argued, and uncertainty spread. Margaret, watching the twins, understood the magnitude of their impact. They were not just surviving. They were transforming the very architecture of control, one imperceptible intervention at a time. The next morning, the consequences of the twins' subtle manipulations became visible beyond the confines of their home. A meeting in a distant town dissolved unexpectedly. Decisions meant to consolidate control failed because key figures arrived late or misread instructions. A ledger crucial to ongoing operations was lost in transit, redirecting influence into unintended channels. Margaret watched and realized the scale of what was happening. Their interventions were no longer local. They were fracturing a network spanning states, even decades of strategy. Eliza began describing timelines that were once hidden, showing Margaret the ripple effects of every minor act. She spoke of men and women, unaware of their participation in the Watcher's network, making decisions unknowingly influenced by the twins' subtle nudges. Each ripple compounded uncertainty, cascading into unforeseen outcomes. Margaret understood that these children were not merely resisting. They were rewriting probabilities, creating fractures that could never be fully repaired. Thomas translated these visions into reality with calm precision. Small adjustments, a window left open, a ledger shifted, a path delayed, multiplied outward like geometric patterns, amplifying their effects. Authority relied on the illusion of predictability, and each variable the twins manipulated rendered that illusion untenable. The Watchers could no longer model outcomes, no longer anticipate moves, no longer enforce their will without risk of error. Margaret recognized a profound truth. Influence is most powerful when invisible, recursive, and unexpected. The twins' abilities were not supernatural. They were strategic. They perceived patterns beyond ordinary observation, anticipated reactions before they occurred, and acted with precision. Authority faltered not because it was weak, but because it assumed compliance, predictability, and ignorance. The twins had eliminated all three. And yet, the Watchers did not surrender. They intensified their coordination, attempting to isolate variables, control messengers, and predict anomalies. Margaret noted how their anxiety became evident in the minutest details: hesitation, overcorrection, conflicting orders. The system that had once seemed impenetrable was now fragile, because perception had outpaced control. Margaret saw it clearly. The twins were no longer participants in a local struggle. They were instruments of systemic revelation, exposing hidden networks, disrupting centuries-old hierarchies, and creating a template for subverting control through awareness and subtle intervention. And here's the lesson for you. Power is never absolute. It exists only in the obedience of those it seeks to control. When perception and action combine in ways authority cannot anticipate, systems fracture silently, unpredictably, and irrevocably. Awareness itself becomes the ultimate weapon. Margaret realized it was time to escalate beyond passive disruption. Observation alone had begun fracturing the Watcher's network, but deliberate symbolic acts could amplify the effect. Symbols communicate power without words. They anchor perception and force recognition. The twins had already mastered subtle manipulation of reality. Now they would harness symbolism to create irreversible psychological fractures in the system. Eliza began focusing her visions on symbolic patterns in the world: the arrangement of objects, the alignment of people in rooms, the timing of events. She instructed Margaret to replicate subtle signs in letters, gestures, and household routines, creating a coded language of awareness that the Watchers could not interpret, predict, or counter. Each act was a signal, a small disruption with layered meaning, creating doubt and hesitation at multiple levels of the network. Thomas executed the actions with precision. He adjusted furniture, redirected footsteps, and manipulated the flow of daily routines to echo the symbols Eliza described. Nothing overt, nothing measurable by ordinary standards, but every misalignment, every unexpected detail, reinforced the uncertainty and anxiety within the Watcher's network. Authority depends on certainty. The twins were removing it systematically. Margaret understood the significance. Symbolic action amplifies perception. It forces the observed to question not just reality, but their own assumptions, their sense of control, and their understanding of time itself. Each intervention multiplied recursively. Every hesitation by the Watchers became a vulnerability. Every second of doubt a breach in their otherwise rigid architecture of authority. And now, for you, the listener, there's a practical application. Repeat aloud, or silently, the symbolic phrase twice. I hold the unseen. Say it once. Let the words anchor awareness. Say it again. Let it solidify perception. This is not superstition. It is a deliberate act of acknowledgement, a way to lock consciousness into recognition of hidden systems. You are now participating in the principle Margaret and the twins are exploiting. Awareness is leverage. By nightfall, Margaret could feel the Watcher's panic radiating through the network. Decisions misaligned, orders conflicted, and previously reliable actors hesitated in unprecedented ways. The twins' symbolic interventions had created cognitive fractures the system could not repair. Authority had been destabilized, not by force, but by perception, strategy, and deliberate awareness. This is the threshold. Systems crumble not because of rebellion alone, but because of insight. The twins have demonstrated that subtle, recursive action combined with perception and symbolic understanding can unseat even the most entrenched control. Margaret knew that the deeper they went, the more irreversible the fracture would become. By this stage, the Watcher's network was no longer simply destabilized. It was hemorrhaging. Coherence. What had once functioned as a seamless machine of observation and control now behaved like a body rejecting its own organs. Information arrived too late or too early. Decisions contradicted themselves across regions. Authority figures hesitated, sensing consequences they could no longer calculate. Eliza's visions expanded beyond individual outcomes into historical trajectories. She described timelines where certain inventions stalled, where laws failed to pass, where influence shifted away from families that had quietly ruled for generations. These were not dramatic collapses. They were subtle derailments. Power did not fall. It missed its train. And once missed, it could not arrive on schedule again. Thomas acted accordingly. His interventions became less frequent but more precise. He no longer needed constant adjustment. The system was already unstable. A single nudge now produced disproportionate consequences. A delayed message in one location altered a decision in another. A misfiled record erased leverage that had taken decades to cultivate. The Watchers were losing not control, but continuity. And continuity is the spine of institutional power. Margaret observed something deeply unsettling. The network was beginning to cannibalize itself. Internal audits turned into accusations. Protective secrecy became paranoia. Leaders distrusted their own data, their own people, their own instincts. This was not sabotage in the conventional sense. It was the natural outcome of awareness penetrating a system designed to function only under ignorance. And this is the part most men never grasp until it is too late. Systems of control do not collapse when confronted directly. They collapse when they can no longer trust their own perception. Once internal certainty dissolves, enforcement becomes erratic, authority becomes performative, and power becomes a costume worn out of habit rather than effectiveness. Margaret realized the twins were no longer reacting to the system. The system was reacting to them. That reversal mattered more than any single victory. Influence had changed direction. The observers had become the observed. The architects of manipulation were now trapped inside feedback loops of their own making. What Eliza saw next unsettled even her. She described future historians puzzled by missing links, gaps where certain powers should have expanded but did not, where dominance softened without explanation. No record of defeat, no uprising, just